Good morning. This is Mrs. Standridge. We're here today for another episode of Raymie Nightingale. So we left off. Raymie found out that she met a couple new people and she found out some odd things about them. One of the girls wanted to win the competition because they didn't have any money, and she was afraid that the county would take her and put her in a home. Another girl, Beverly, didn't want to win the competition. She wanted to sabotage the competition. So let's find out what Raymie does about this. 9. "Stop that!" shouted the woman behind the wheel of the car. Beverly did not stop. She kept whamming away. "I paid good money for that baton," the woman said to Raymie. "Make her stop." "Me?" said Raymie. "Yes, you," said the woman. "Who else is standing here besides you? Get that baton away from her." The woman had green eyeshadow on her eyelids and big fake eyelashes, and also a lot of rouge on her cheeks. But underneath the rouge and the eyeshadow and the fake eyelashes, she looked very familiar. She looked like Beverly Topinski, except older and angrier, if that was possible. "Why do I have to do everything?" said the woman. That was the kind of question that had no answer, the kind of question that adults seem to be overly fond of asking. Before Raymie could even attempt some sort of response, the woman was out of the car and had hold of Beverly's baton and was pulling on it, and Beverly was pulling back. More dust rose up in the air. "Let go," said Beverly. "You let go," said the woman, who was surely Beverly's mother, even though she wasn't really acting like a mother. "Stop this nonsense immediately." This command issued from Ida Nee, who had appeared out of nowhere and who was standing in front of them with her white boots glowing and her baton stretched out in front of her like a sword. She looked like an avenging angel in a Sunday school storybook. Beverly and the woman stopped wrestling. "What is going on here, Rhonda?" said Ida Nee. "Nothing," said the woman. "Can't you control your daughter?" said Ida Nee. "She started it," said Beverly. "Get out of here, both of you," said Ida Nee. She pointed her baton at the car. "And don't come back until you can behave properly. You should be ashamed of yourself, Rhonda, a champion twirler like you." Beverly got in the back of the car, and her mother got in the front. They both slammed their doors at the same time. "See you tomorrow," said Raymie, as the car pulled out of the driveway. "Ha!" said Beverly. "You're never going to see me again." For some reason, these words felt like a punch to the stomach. They felt like someone sneaking down a hallway in the middle of the night, carrying their shoes in their hand, leaving without saying goodbye. Raymie turned away from the car and looked at Ida Nee, who shook her head, marched past Raymie, and went into her baton-twirling office, which was really just a garage, and closed the door. Raymie's soul was not a tent. It was not even a pebble. Her soul, it seemed, had disappeared entirely. After a long time, or what seemed like a long time, Raymie's mother arrived. "How were the lessons?" she asked when Raymie got in the car. "Complicated," said Raymie. "Everything is complicated," said her mother. "I can't even begin to imagine why you would want to learn how to twirl a baton. Last summer it was the life-saving lessons. This summer it's twirling. None of it makes any sense to me." Raymie looked down at the baton in her lap. "I have a plan," she wanted to say, "and the baton twirling is part of the plan." She closed her eyes and imagined her father in a booth, in a diner, sitting across from Leanne Dickerson. She imagined her father opening the paper and discovering that she was Little Miss Central Florida Tire. Wouldn't he be impressed? Wouldn't he want to come home immediately? And wouldn't Leanne Dickerson be amazed and jealous? "What could your father possibly see in that woman?" said Raymie's mother, almost as if she knew what Raymie was thinking. "What could he see in her?" Raymie added this question to the list of impossible, unanswerable questions that adults seemed inclined to ask her. She thought about Mr. Staphopoulos, her life-saving coach from the summer before. He was not the kind of man who asked questions that didn't have answers. Mr. Staphopoulos only ever asked one question: "Are you going to be a problem causer or a problem solver?" And the answer was obvious. You had to be a problem solver. 10. Mr. Staphopoulos had fur on his toes and fur all down his back. He wore a silver whistle around his neck. Raymie didn't think that he ever took the whistle off. Mr. Staphopoulos was very passionate about people not drowning. "Land is an afterthought, people." That was what Mr. Staphopoulos said to all his Life-Saving 101 students. "The world is made of water, and drowning is an ever-present danger. We must help each other. Let's be problem solvers together." Then Mr. Staphopoulos would blow his whistle, throw Edgar into the water, and the life-saving lesson would begin. Edgar was the drowning dummy. He was 5 feet 3 inches tall. He was dressed in jeans and a checked button-down shirt. He had buttons for eyes, and his smile was drawn on with a red permanent marker. He was stuffed with cotton that never dried out properly, and there were stones sewn into his hands and feet and stomach so that he would sink. He smelled of mildew, a sweet, sad kind of smell. Mr. Staphopoulos had made Edgar. He had designed him to drown. It seemed like a strange reason to be called into the world, to drown, to be saved, to drown again. It also seemed strange to Raymie that Edgar was doomed to smile through the whole thing. If she had made Edgar, she would have put a more quizzical look on his face. But in any case, Edgar and Mr. Staphopoulos were both gone now. They had moved to North Carolina at the end of last summer. Raymie had seen them in the parking lot of the Tag and Bag grocery the day they left. All of Mr. Staphopoulos' belongings were packed into his station wagon, and some things were even tied on top. Edgar was sitting in the back seat, staring straight ahead. He was smiling, of course. Mr. Staphopoulos was just getting into the car. Raymie called out, "Goodbye, Mr. Staphopoulos." "Raymie," he said, turning around. "Raymie Clark." He closed the door of the station wagon and walked toward her. He put his hand on her head. It was hot in the Tag and Bag parking lot. There were seagulls whirling and screeching, and Mr. Staphopoulos' hand on top of her head was heavy and light at the same time. Mr. Staphopoulos was wearing khaki pants and flip-flops. Raymie could see the fur on his feet. The whistle was around his neck, and the sun reflected off of it and made the whistle into a little circle of light. It looked like something in the center of Mr. Staphopoulos was on fire. The sun glinted off the abandoned grocery carts and made them magical, beautiful. Everything shimmered. The seagulls called out. Raymie thought that something wonderful was going to happen. But nothing happened except that Mr. Staphopoulos kept his hand on her head for what seemed like a long time, and then he lifted his hand and squeezed her shoulder and said, "Goodbye, Raymie." Just that. "Goodbye, Raymie." Why did those words matter so much? Raymie didn't know. 11. At home, after the very strange baton twirling class, Raymie sat in her room with the door closed and worked on the Little Miss Central Florida tire application. It was a 2-page mimeographed form, and it was obvious that Mr. Pitt, the owner of Central Florida Tire, had typed the form himself. He was not a very good typist. The application was full of errors, which for some reason made the whole enterprise, the contest and the hope that Raymie would win it, and the further hope that winning it would bring her father home, seem dubious. The first question was in all capital letters. It said, "Do you want to become Little Miss Central Florida Tire 1975?" There was no space for an answer to this question. Still, it was a question, and Raymie felt like it would be best to answer it, since the application said, "Make sure you answer all questions." Raymie squeezed in the word yes right after the question mark. She used all capital letters. She thought about adding an exclamation mark, but decided against it. And then she filled in her name, Raymie Clark, and her address, 1213 Borton Street, Lister, Florida, and then her age, 10. She wondered if Louisiana and Beverly were sitting in their rooms filling out their applications. Did you have to fill out an application for a contest if you intended to sabotage the contest? Raymie closed her eyes and saw Louisiana writing the words, "The Flying Elefantes," in the air with her baton. How could Raymie compete against somebody from a show business background? Raymie opened her eyes and looked out the window. Old Mrs. Borkowski was sitting in a lawn chair in the middle of the road. Her shoes were untied. Her face was lifted up to the sun. Raymie's mother said that Mrs. Borkowski was as crazy as a loon. Raymie didn't know if this was true or not, but it seemed to her that Mrs. Borkowski knew things, important things. Some of the things she knew, she told. And some of the things she knew, she refused to tell, saying nothing but "pfft" when Raymie asked for more information. Old Mrs. Borkowski probably knew who the Flying Elefantes were. Raymie looked back down at the application. It said, "Please list all of your good deeds. Use a separate sheet of paper if necessary." Good deeds? What good deeds? Raymie's stomach clenched. She got up from the desk and left her room and went out the front door and walked into the middle of the street. She stood in front of Mrs. Borkowski's lawn chair. "What?" said Mrs. Borkowski without opening her eyes. "I'm filling out an application," said Raymie. "Yes, and so?" "I'm supposed to do good deeds," said Raymie. "One time," said Mrs. Borkowski. She smacked her lips. Her eyes were still closed. "One time something happened." Obviously, Mrs. Borkowski intended to tell a story. Raymie sat down in the middle of the road at Mrs. Borkowski's feet. The pavement was warm. She looked at Mrs. Borkowski's untied shoes. Mrs. Borkowski never tied her shoes. She was too old to reach her feet. "One time something happened," said Mrs. Borkowski again. "I was on a boat at sea, and I saw a baby get snatched from his mother's arms by a bird, a gigantic seabird." "Is this a story about a good deed?" asked Raymie. "It was terrible how the mother screamed." "But the mother got the baby back, right?" "From a gigantic seabird? Never," said Mrs. Borkowski. "Those gigantic seabirds, they keep what they take. Also, they steal buttons and hairpins." Mrs. Borkowski lowered her head and opened her eyes and looked at Raymie. She blinked. Mrs. Borkowski had very sad, extremely watery eyes. The wings of the seabird were huge. They looked like they belonged to an angel. So was the seabird actually an angel? Was it doing a good deed and saving the baby? "Pfft," said Mrs. Borkowski. She waved her hand through the air. "Who knows? I'm only telling you what happened, what I saw. Make of it what you will. Tomorrow you come over and cut my toenails, and I will give you some of that divinity candy, okay?" "Okay," said Mrs. Raymie. Did cutting Mrs. Borkowski's toenails count as a good deed? Probably not. Mrs. Borkowski always gave Raymie candy in exchange for the toenail cutting, and if you got paid for something, it couldn't be a good deed. Mrs. Borkowski closed her eyes. She tilted her head back again. After a while, she started to snore. Raymie got up and went in the house and into the kitchen. She picked up the phone and dialed her father's office. Clark Family Insurance, said Mrs. Sylvester in her cartoon bird voice. How may we protect you? Raymie said nothing. Mrs. Sylvester cleared her throat. Clark Family Insurance, she said again. How may we protect you? It was nice to hear Mrs. Sylvester ask, how may we protect you, a second time. Actually, Raymie thought that she would like to hear Mrs. Sylvester ask the question several hundred times a day. It was such a friendly question. It was a question that promised good things. Mrs. Sylvester, she said. Yes, dear, said Mrs. Sylvester. Raymie closed her eyes and imagined the gigantic jar of candy corn sitting on Mrs. Sylvester's desk. Sometimes in the late afternoon the sun shone directly on the jar and lit it up so that it looked like a lamp. Raymie wondered if that was happening now. Behind Mrs. Sylvester's desk was the door to Raymie's father's office. The door would be closed and the office would be empty. No one would be sitting at her father's desk because her father was gone. Raymie tried to conjure up his face. She tried to imagine him sitting in his office at his desk. She couldn't do it. She felt a wave of panic. Her father had only been gone for 2 days and she couldn't remember his face. She had to bring him back. She remembered why she was calling. Mrs. Sylvester, she said, you have to perform good deeds for the contest. Oh, honey, said Mrs. Sylvester, that is no problem at all. You just go down the street to the Golden Glen and offer to read to one of the residents. The elderly love to be read to. Did the elderly love to be read to? Raymie wasn't sure. Old Mrs. Burkowski was elderly, and what she always wanted Raymie to do was clip her toenails. How was your first baton twirling lesson? Asked Mrs. Sylvester. It was interesting, said Raymie. An image of Louisiana Elefante falling to her knees flashed through her head. This image was followed by one of Beverly Topinski and her mother fighting over the baton in a cloud of gravel dust. Isn't it exciting to be learning something new? Said Mrs. Sylvester. Yes, said Raymie. How's your mother doing, dear? Said Mrs. Sylvester. She's sitting on the couch in the sunroom right now. She does that a lot. Mostly that's what she does. She doesn't really do anything else. She just sits there. Well, said Mrs. Sylvester. There was a long pause. It will be fine. You'll see. We all do what we can do. Okay, said Raymie. Louisiana's words floated through her head. I'm too terrified to go on. Raymie didn't say the words out loud, but she felt them pass through her. And Mrs. Sylvester, kind, bird-voiced Mrs. Sylvester, must have felt them too, because she said, You just select a suitable book for sharing, dear, and then go down through the Golden Glen. They will be very glad to see you there. You just do what you can do, okay? Everything will be fine. It will all work out right in the end. All right, we're going to stop right here for today. Tomorrow we'll start back with Chapter 12. I hope that you can join me then. Goodbye.